The war was almost over, but the danger was not. On April 9, 1945, a thin mist rolled across the outskirts of a tiny German village named Hinterwald. Smoke drifted from distant ruins, carried by a wind that smelled of burnt timber and damp earth. The residents, old men, frightened mothers, children clutching blankets, huddled in their cellars, listening for footsteps that might decide their fate. They expected the worst. 4 months, word had traveled from town to town. Soldiers, any soldiers, meant chaos. Looting, revenge, broken doors, empty cupboards, another wound in a war full of them. At dawn, the villagers heard engines, vehicles, heavy boots, foreign voices, British forces. A unit of weary British soldiers entered the village with weapons ready, not knowing what resistance might remain. The war had pushed them through endless miles of wreckage, flattened towns, desperate civilians, ambushes in quiet woods. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. But soon, something unexpected happened. As the soldiers dismounted, they saw no snipers, no barricades, no armed men, only a group of trembling villagers standing in front of their chapel. They weren't defending it. They were pleading for it. Behind them, chaos erupted at the village edge. Another band of armed fighters, not German soldiers, not British troops, but opportunistic looters trailing behind the collapsing front. They had come to claim whatever the war had left behind. The villagers braced themselves, waiting for destruction to swallow their home from both sides. Instead, the British commanding sergeant gave a single, sharp order. And everything changed. British soldiers turned, not on the villagers, not on the chapel, not on the homes, but on the looters. They positioned themselves between the helpless civilians and the approaching threat, rifles raised with deliberate authority. These weren't men seeking vengeance. These were soldiers who had seen enough senseless suffering and refused to add to it. In a world torn apart, protection came from the direction the villagers feared most. A German village. British soldiers. A confrontation no one expected. And on that day, fate twisted the script of war in a way that would echo for decades. To understand why British soldiers ended up defending a German village, a scene that seemed impossible after 6 years of brutal war, we need to step back into the final, chaotic months of 1945. Germany was collapsing from every direction. Cities smoldered. Roads overflowed with civilians fleeing bombed-out towns. Columns of refugees walked beside retreating soldiers, all of them exhausted shadows of who they were before the war. Bridges lay shattered. Rail lines twisted. Forests echoed with artillery that never seemed to stop. On the Western Front, British and American forces pushed deeper into Germany. Their mission was clear: break the last pockets of resistance, occupy territory, secure supply routes, disarm remaining units, and prevent any final, desperate counterattack. But the battlefield had changed. The Wehrmacht was fractured. Communication lines were severed. Isolated bands of fighters roamed the countryside, some still resisting, others simply surviving. And trailing the chaos, like vultures following a dying animal, came looters, deserters, and criminals disguised as soldiers. They targeted abandoned towns, undefended homes, and frightened villagers with no one left to protect them. This is where the village of Hinterwald found itself. It was a tiny agricultural settlement tucked between rolling hills and dense forest, far from major roads or strategic targets. For most of the war, it had been spared the worst of the destruction. But by April 1945, that isolation offered no protection. German forces had pulled back days earlier, leaving behind only civilians. Those who remained were mostly elderly, young mothers, and children, people with no strength left to flee, and nowhere to go if they tried. Inside every home hung the same fear. What happens when foreign soldiers arrive? Stories circulated endlessly. Some villages had been spared. Others had been plundered. And no one could predict which fate awaited Hinterwald. On the British side, the soldiers advancing toward the village were not the fresh, confident men of 1939. These were battle-worn troops, survivors of Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhineland. They had seen towns destroyed by retreating German units, seen civilians starving, seen cruelty committed by soldiers and civilians alike. They had liberated camps, crossed rivers under fire, and buried their own friends in foreign soil. So when the British column approached Hinterwald on an early April morning, they were prepared for anything. But what they found was not a German stronghold. No trenches. No machine gun nests. No signs of organized defense. Only a terrified population standing in front of a chapel, their last symbol of safety. The commanding British sergeant signaled his men to hold position. The troops spread out, scanning windows and rooftops, expecting an ambush. But the villagers remained still, trembling not from hatred, but from fear of what might come next. The sergeant stepped forward. A village elder stepped forward. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the elder pointed toward the forest edge. His voice wavered, not from hostility, but from warning. Another group was coming. And they weren't British. And they weren't German regulars. They were armed scavengers, predators feeding on the dying war. The British soldiers glanced toward the tree line. They recognized the type immediately. These men followed chaos, not orders. They didn't fight battles. They hunted opportunity. Looters were a plague that no side admitted, but both suffered from. The British sergeant understood something instantly. If he did nothing, the villagers would be destroyed within minutes. And that realization forced a decision no training manual had prepared him for. Was his duty only to fight German soldiers? Or did his duty extend to protecting civilians, even German ones, when law and order collapsed? What happened next would define that answer forever. The moment the British sergeant understood what approached the village, something shifted in his posture. He had marched through towns filled with fear before, but this was different. These villagers weren't begging for mercy from him. They were warning him of a threat closing in from behind the trees. The British troops tightened their grips on their rifles. Eyes narrowed. The uneasy morning air felt colder, heavier. A young British private pointed toward the tree line. Figures were emerging, slow, bold, deliberate. Not soldiers in formation. Not units following orders. But a ragged band of armed looters wearing scraps of uniforms from different divisions, some with mismatched insignias, some without any at all. Their boots sank into the soft soil. Their rifles were slung with a careless arrogance that only men without consequences carried. They had the look of men who believed the war had already ended for them, who believed they could take whatever they wanted while armies focused on the final battles elsewhere. They expected Hinterwald to be empty. They expected no resistance. They expected prey, not protection. The villagers felt the British soldiers stiffen, but they didn't move. They stood frozen, clutching the chapel door, holding on to one another, breath trembling in the morning air. The looters spotted the British uniforms. They paused, not in fear, but in calculation. They outnumbered the British soldiers nearly 2-1. And this band had fought skirmishes before. To them, British troops were just another obstacle between them and whatever the village still had. Chickens, grain, jewelry, alcohol, bedding, livestock, anything that could be carried or sold. The British sergeant knew that look. He'd seen it in the aftermath of other villages. Homes ransacked, children crying, elders beaten. Looters didn't follow rules. They didn't stop when guns were pointed. They stopped only when shown overwhelming resolve. He stepped forward, planting his boots firmly on the dirt road. Behind him, his men moved in practiced lines, fanning out with calm precision. Their bayonets glinted in the thin light. Their expressions settled into an unspoken vow. Not here. Not today. Not this village. The looters exchanged glances. One of them, taller, broad-shouldered, carrying an old Mauser slung across his chest, smirked. He took a few confident steps forward, hands raised in exaggerated mock surrender. His companions chuckled. The British sergeant did not move. He did not lower his rifle. He simply stared, unblinking. It was a stare that said, "This ground is protected." The tension thickened. Birds fell silent. Even the air seemed to wait. The tall looter tilted his head as if asking, Are you sure you want to do this? For them. He gestured casually toward the villagers, toward the same people British newspapers had once called the enemy. He expected hesitation, doubt, maybe even disgust. Instead, the sergeant shifted his stance and spoke just a few quiet words to his men. Hold the line. The British soldiers adjusted their rifles with deliberate, synchronized motion. Boots set firmly, shoulders squared, and something undeniable became clear. These weren't men seeking vengeance. These weren't men hunting glory. These were professional soldiers, structured, disciplined, and bound by a sense of duty greater than orders on a page. The looters sensed it too. Their smirks faded. Fingers tightened subtly on triggers. The tall one lowered his hands slowly, reassessing. The British sergeant didn't blink. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, one of the villagers stepped forward. A woman. Gray-haired. Frail. Her hands shook as she raised them. Not in fear, but in gratitude. She stepped between the British soldiers and the villagers behind her, bowing her head toward the British line, acknowledging their protection. Something about that gesture struck the looters like a slap. The village was not theirs to take. Not anymore. But the looters were not finished. Not yet. Their leader raised 2 fingers and gave a sharp whistle. More figures emerged from the trees. Half a dozen, then more. A growing presence meant to intimidate. Their boots sank into the mud as they moved toward the road. It was a silent challenge. Step aside. These people are nothing. The British sergeant's jaw tensed. He gave another short command, and more British soldiers moved to reinforce the line. Their uniforms were muddy, their faces hollow with exhaustion. But their resolve hardened with every step. They'd seen war destroy too many innocents already. They weren't about to let it happen again. The looters began to spread out, forming a loose semicircle. A standoff hung like ice between 2 sides who understood exactly what was at stake. The British soldiers had orders to push forward, not to defend villages. They had no obligation to risk their lives for civilians on enemy soil. But duty, true duty, doesn't always follow the printed page. Sometimes it follows conscience. The British sergeant raised his hand. His soldiers aimed their rifles. The looters paused. And for the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. Because these British troops weren't bluffing. They weren't playing politics. They weren't seeking justification. They were prepared to defend strangers at the end of a bitter war. And the looters realized something dangerous. They were about to fight men with nothing left to lose, and everything left to protect. The next seconds would decide the fate of Hinterwald forever. The standoff felt like it stretched across whole minutes, but in truth, it lasted only seconds. Seconds filled with the kind of silence that squeezes breath from the lungs. The British soldiers stood in a tight defensive line, rifles raised, boots planted. The looters faced them from the tree lean, tense and shifting, caught between greed and self-preservation. Then a single movement tipped the balance. One looter, nervous, twitching, lifted his weapon a little too quickly. He wasn't aiming, not yet, but he might as well have been. It was enough. The British sergeant gave a sharp signal. Not a shout. Not a warning. Just a precise gesture, honed through years of battlefield clarity. In an instant, the British soldiers moved. They stepped forward as one, tightening the line, rifles locked into firing position. Their boots struck the ground in a deliberate, unified rhythm. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The looters reacted in a ripple of panic. Some raised weapons. Some froze. Some stepped back instinctively, realizing too late that they were facing disciplined, battle-tested troops, not frightened villagers. The tall looter who had smirked earlier cursed under his breath. He raised his rifle, but before he could even sight it, a British private fired a single, controlled shot, not at the man, but into the dirt directly in front of him. Soil burst upward, scattering across his boots. It was a warning, a clear, unmistakable boundary. One more step, and this becomes a battle. The tall looter's confidence cracked. Behind the British line, The villagers gasped. Mothers pulled children behind them. Elderly men clasped their hands, praying not for victory, but for survival. The British sergeant advanced another step. "Turn back," he said, his voice low and steady. "Now." The looters exchanged frantic looks. They weren't trained soldiers. They weren't prepared to face men who had crossed Normandy, fought through the Ardennes, and survived artillery that turned forests into splinters. These British troops carried that history in their posture, in the way they breathed, aimed, and held their nerve. The sergeant's men didn't flinch. They didn't negotiate. They didn't show fear. They stood for something larger than orders. One looter fired a wild, panicked shot. The bullet hissed overhead, kicking dust from a nearby stone wall. The villagers screamed and ducked. A child cried out. The British soldiers reacted with lightning discipline. Half the line knelt. The other half steadied their aim. But the sergeant lifted a hand. "Hold fire." The restraint was shocking, the kind that only came from absolute command over fear and fury. He took another step forward. "You fire again," he said quietly, "and you won't leave this road." His voice didn't carry anger. It carried certainty. And certainty is far more frightening than rage. The looter who had fired lowered his weapon, eyes darting wildly. The others began to back up, stumbling over roots and rocks as they retreated toward the treeline. The tall looter snarled, spit on the ground, and shouted something guttural, but he backed up too. Because in that moment, every one of them understood the truth. They weren't facing men enforcing British victory. They were facing men enforcing law, decency, order, the things the looters had been exploiting since the front began to collapse. The sergeant's hand remained raised. The looters continued to withdraw, step by step, tree by tree, until the forest swallowed them completely. Silence returned in a heavy wave, broken only by the shaky breaths of villagers and the soft metallic clicks of British soldiers lowering their rifles. The danger had passed, not through bloodshed, but through resolve. When the British sergeant finally lowered his hand, his men relaxed their stance, but their faces remained taut. They had faced violence so many times that restraint felt like its own form of battle. The villager who had stepped forward earlier, her gray hair trembling in the breeze, moved closer. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her hand on the sergeant's sleeve. No words. No long speech. Just a trembling gesture of gratitude from someone who had prepared for death and found protection instead. Around them, the villagers emerged from doorways, cellars, barns. Children peeked from behind coats. Men stood straighter. Mothers wiped tears from their cheeks. Relief washed over the square like warm air breaking through frost. The British soldiers glanced at one another. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to being seen as saviors in the land they had fought for so long. They were used to suspicion, fear, resignation, not gratitude. But this moment, the quiet thanks, the fragile hope, left a mark deeper than any battlefield victory. Because in a war filled with destruction, today they had prevented it. The sergeant exhaled slowly, grounding himself. His men adjusted their gear, checked their weapons, and prepared for what came next. The war wasn't over. Their march would continue. But for a brief moment, in a small forgotten village, they had restored something nearly erased by years of violence. The British soldiers remained in Hinterwald for only a few hours after the standoff, but for the villagers, it felt like the world had shifted. Relief washed through the narrow streets, soft as morning fog and twice as unreal. Doors opened. Faces emerged. For the first time in weeks, people breathed without waiting for footsteps behind them. Children studied the British soldiers with a strange mixture of awe and confusion. They had been raised on stories of enemies. Men who burned villages, shattered lives, stole futures. Yet here stood those very enemies, guarding the road, watching the forest, ensuring no looter dared return. The British troops, weary from months of marching, leaned on their rifles and studied the homes around them. The village was poor. Walls cracked. Roofs damaged. Smoke drifted from chimneys where families had burned their last scraps of firewood. There were no hidden stockpiles, no treasures worth stealing. only the fragile remains of a community trying to survive the collapse of a nation. A few women approached the British sergeant, offering the only thanks they could: a loaf of coarse bread, a pitcher of watered-down milk, a handful of apples shriveled by winter. The sergeant shook his head at first, not wanting to take from people who had so little. But the villagers insisted. It wasn't a payment, it was recognition. A gesture of dignity. The moment revealed something few expected. Humanity had not vanished on either side. As the British column prepared to move on, the villagers gathered by the chapel once more. Children waved shyly. Elderly men bowed stiffly from the waist, their eyes glistening. The sergeant nodded back, a silent exchange between people who didn't share a language, but understood the meaning just the same. Before leaving, the sergeant pulled aside two soldiers and instructed them to walk the outskirts of the village one last time, to make sure no looters waited for the British to disappear. The patrol circled the fields, listened to the trees, and only returned once they were sure the danger had truly passed. Then, with quiet discipline, the British troops marched out the way they came. Their boots faded into the distance. The village remained standing. For Hinterwald, the moment became legend, a story whispered in kitchens, repeated to grandchildren, preserved in fading diaries. A reminder that even at the bitter end of a brutal war, compassion could still appear in uniform. That not every man with a rifle came to take. Some came to protect. For the British soldiers, the memory endured in a different way. They had crossed bridges under artillery fire, advanced through ruined cities, buried friends under foreign soil. Yet years later, when veterans spoke of the war, many remembered Hinterwald, not because it was a battle, but because it wasn't. It was proof that even in the final weeks of destruction, when hatred was expected and violence assumed, men could still choose decency over cruelty. That mercy was not weakness. That protecting the vulnerable, no matter who they were, was the clearest expression of victory. The war would end soon after. Borders would shift. Armies would disband. Nations would rebuild from ashes. But in one small German village, on an ordinary April morning, the laws of conflict were broken in the best way possible. No shots exchanged. No homes destroyed. No lives taken. Just a line of soldiers who refused to step aside. And in the quiet that followed, Hinterwald learned something the war had nearly stolen forever. Enemies are made by nations, but humanity is chosen by individuals.